that case, if you have questions, you may put them in the chat. Also, if you want to tweet about the event, we have a hashtag Fiscal Matters that you can use. I put it in the chat. Don't hesitate to share also your thoughts or echo the workshop on Twitter. So this capacity building workshop is building on another workshop that we organized a couple of days ago with the European Youth Forum, where we discussed the basics of what is fiscal policy and what the EU fiscal framework is exactly. And we are going to start with a short reminder that Thomas from European Youth Forum is going to present about the session we held on Monday, so that we all start on the same footing. And then we are going to speak into more depth about 4 myths around the EU fiscal framework. There are certainly many more myths which are used as objections against any reform of the fiscal framework, but we chose for this workshop to go deeper into 4 of these myths. We will, of course, have plenty of opportunity to ask questions or to react on each of these myths. And then in the latest part of the workshop, we would like to have breakout groups to reflect, brainstorm together on each of these myths and how we could campaign about them, debunk these myths, communicate, imagine slogans about destroying these myths. So that will be the activist part of the workshop. So without further delay, I believe I would like to handle the floor to Thomas. And I believe that Ludovic, yeah, you preceded my thought, sharing the slides. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Isabelle, for the introduction. Yes, as Isabelle was saying, this is building on a workshop that we did on Monday. However, if you were not there on Monday, we have a little refresher for you. Thanks, Ludovic. So what we mean by the European Fiscal Framework is a set of rules and mechanisms that constrain and restrict what member states of the European Union can do in terms of government spending. So the sacrosanct and very famous rules are that it is forbidden to have more than 60% of your country's GDP in public debt, and that year on year, your budget deficit cannot be more than 3% of GDP. That's, in a nutshell, the EU fiscal framework, although it's a much more complicated animal than that, of course. When your country does pass these thresholds, there's an excessive debt procedure and an excessive deficit procedure. And countries have to plan and follow plans to reduce deficit and debt. Where we are now is that these rules have been suspended because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need that happened to spend more public money in order to support companies, support households, and all the public spending that we've seen. This is called the General Escape Clause, and it's going to be there at least until the end of 2022. But the question is, then what? What happens next? Next slide, please. The question is, then what? And when we say what, we also mean, did we learn any lessons from the past? So before I go into these graphs, which shouldn't scare you off, they're really easy, I'll explain. What happened in 2008, 2009, as you know, was there was a great recession, a great crisis that in some ways is similar to the economic crisis that we're seeing through following the pandemic. So what happened then is, if we look at the graph on the left, what you see in blue is the GDP of the EU 27. What you see in red is total net investments. And when we started with fiscal tightening, strict fiscal rules, austerity, contractionary policy, whatever you call it, in the beginning of the 2010s, this investment, by definition, was reduced and did never catch up with GDP. So we have a big lack of investment in the EU that's due to these strict fiscal rules. The graph on the right says pretty much the same thing. It just compares net public investment this time in the EU it's in the euro area, which follows these rules very closely. It compares it to US and non-euro EU, and it shows that net public investment is way lower than it is elsewhere. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, another point that we mentioned in the first workshop is that fiscal policy is one of the tools that governments have to deal with the challenges of today. So ensure a fair and sustainable recovery, remedy intergenerational and actually all kinds of inequalities, invest in the infrastructure and the technologies of the future, and basically do all that good stuff. But most of all, and I think that's one of the important points that we're going to be touching today as well, it is an indispensable instrument. It is absolutely necessary to use public investment to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And I think we'll try to prove that as much as we can today. Next slide, please, Ludo. Another point I wanted to share with you that stresses the urgency of reforming the fiscal framework is this graph here. The central government debt of the EU 27 as a whole, but also of specific national governments, has been above the 60% threshold for a long time in many countries, and it has grown so much in the past year or past 2 years that right now saying that in 2023 we go back to the rules and everybody needs to get back to 60% of GDP in debt seems absolutely impossible and would actually be dangerous. So the rules of that fiscal framework appear more and more outdated, and the question is it time for a reform? If we can go to the next slide, please. So we do believe that a reform is critically needed. And we're not the only ones. The European Commission is set to launch the economic governance review sometime in the coming weeks. We've been talking about it during this week of debate quite a lot. Actually, I just wanted to add that the economic governance review had been started before the pandemic hit. So the idea that the fiscal framework was outdated, needed reform, is pre-pandemic, and now that the pandemic hit, it's even more urgent to do something and reform the framework. And in order to all be ready, you and us, to engage in this review and engage in this debate, this workshop has for goal to debunk a few myths that tend to pollute that debate. Next slide, please. Just before we move into our myths, there's one technical point that will be useful for everyone today. It's called the Fiscal Multiplier, or also called the Canadian Multiplier, in the name of John Maynard Keynes, the economist. And it's a phenomenon that happens when governments start spending more. So when what we say in Keynesian economics is that a recession is when aggregate demand goes down. right? Aggregate demand is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Usually in a recession, you have consumption and investment that go down and are reduced because economic uncertainty and wages going down, people getting unemployed, so they consume less, they invest less. So what we do in these cases is we want to get that aggregate demand go back up. So since we can't directly change consumption or investments, or actually net exports, we start spending more public money, government spending goes up, the aggregate demand goes up, and you have your business cycle that goes up again. Next slide, please. The part that's important, and that's called the fiscal multiplier, is that when you start spending more public money, it actually gets more consumption and more investment going as well. So to say it in numbers, when you spend €1 of public money, you get more than €1 of GDP growth. You get 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 euros because of this effect on consumption and investment. And that's what is called the fiscal multiplier. In recessions, it's superior to 1 generally. And when it's superior to 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, maybe 1.4, then you have this effect on the slide right there. So that's the fiscal multiplier. I hope it helps for the following moments. And Ludo, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Thomas. So, hi everyone. My name is Ludovic Suttor-Sorel. I'm working for Finance Watch as a research and advocacy officer. I will present to meet the first one being the idea that you probably have often heard in the media, in the press, that public budget must stay in surplus, just like this of a healthy household. So for us, this myth that we have heard in the mouth of Angela Merkel many times, that's famously said that Europe should emulate the famously thrifty Swabian housewife. She also said that she was amazed that men need a fiscal treaty to understand good housekeeping with budget, while women have been doing this successfully for years. So as you can see, this type of analogy is really sort of common even to the highest level to make this type of comparison. But in our perception understanding, it's really a fallacy for many reasons. I won't explain everything in detail, but if you just think about few features of a state and of household, you can directly understand that you can't really compare public debt to private debt. The main first point and main feature to take into account is the fact that a state is eternal, while households are obviously not. Which means for debt that an household have to repay its debt during a certain amount of time during his lifetime, which is not the case for the states, which means that while households have to put money aside to be able to repay both the principal and the interest, the states can roll over its stock of debt perpetually. So basically, when sovereign bonds arrive at maturity, the state in general issue another bonds to repay the first one, and so on and so forth. So what's really important for a state is the cost of interest that can change through time. But we'll discuss that a bit later. Another point is the fact that households have just to take care about their own financial stability, their life, but have no role about the whole society as such, which is obviously not the case for the state, which has to handle macroeconomic stability. So it relates to what has just been said by Thomas. In case of recession, the state has a particular role to play. And also the state is public good oriented. So basically it means that it has to spend on this type of good that are not really profitable, but that has to be funded. For example, I don't know, biodiversity conservation is not something you can take a revenue stream from, but something you have to do in any case. So while we can obviously think that in some case, public budget surplus can be useful, why not? The really important question is when public surplus are counterproductive. And here there are three, in our opinion, three main moments. The first one is when the economy is depressed, which means when an economy faces a high level of unemployment, not enough economic activities. When the economy is unsustainable and face what we call a Finance Watch disruption risk. And third, when debt is particularly cheap. What we say in technical term is when interest rates fall below the growth rate. So the first one, I won't spend too many time on that, as Thomas just explained what was a fiscal multiplier in time of crisis. But basically what we have to remember is that when there is not enough economic activity and high unemployment, it's good that the government is going to deficit, and it's really the fiscally responsible course of action. It's what has been done with the COVID crisis, and for good reason, we know that for years, it's really what's necessary. But what can also be useful, you can do deficit, but you can spend on many different types of things. One type of thing you could, it's what we can call growth enhancing expenditure. For example, you can decide to spend on investment, on industrial policy. For example, you could decide that for the south of Italy or the south of my country, Belgium, we could do some sort of industrial policy, to help develop economic activity where there is not enough economic activity. And this would result in lowering the debt to GDP ratio because you have a higher GDP. But what we know in 2021, it's also that undifferentiated economic growth can be environmentally harmful. It can increase disruption risk and in the long run have an impact on debt sustainability as such. And this leads me to the second point, the second moment where seeking public budget surplus is really counterproductive, is when your economy is unsustainable. So as we all know, climate change will have certain costs. We all heard the number about 430 billion euro for the EU green funding gap until 2030 to reach our objective. And we hear, when you hear about sustainable finance or climate change, a lot of time in the EU bubble, it's about how to make sure that private finance will fund climate change mitigation. But what we know for a fact is that a large part of the investment needed to transition does not really have a business case. Actually, McKinsey show that 60% of this investment have no business case until 2030, which means that if you want to transition, you have to acknowledge that it's the public budget that will be that will have to spend on this. And so this is the first category of the cost of climate change that will be ultimately borne by public budget, is the transition to low carbon economy. For example, you can think about retrofitting public building, some energy in public infrastructure, support to citizens, to workers when their own industry have had to transition or to close. But another type of spending which will be which had to be done by public budgets is in case of extreme weather event, like we saw this summer with the public support which was needed after the flood. And the last one is the investment in adaptation to climate change, like flood control, coastal defense, resilience, public infrastructure. So while part of this investment can be planned, it can be forecast in public budgets, part of these are really uncertain. You're not sure if you're going to arrive to 1.5, 2 degree, 4 degree. And if it's 4 degree, what are going to be the consequences? Do we need more coastal defense, resilient public infrastructure? We don't really know. What about the extreme weather event? And all this uncertainty is called, in general, a fiscal risk. In this case, if you probably all are familiar with the notion of climate-related financial risk, which is basically the impact that climate change will have on banks, on financial markets. The new notion that we really all need to have in mind is the idea of climate-related fiscal risk, which impact is going to have on the public budget in the long run. On that, there is a quite large study on many advanced and emerging economy that have shown the price and the cost of different type of fiscal risk. The first one, obviously, in amount is financial sector. So you will remember the great financial crisis and the cost on public budget, and therefore the austerity at a later stage. But there is also a certain cost for natural disaster. So it's the red boxes that you can see on the screen. And what's shown that in average, the cost of natural disaster is 1.6% of GDP, but can go up to 6% of GDP. But this was for the past. So this number, 6% of GDP, is the worst case scenario before now. But what the real question is what's going to happen if we cross some climate tipping point? It's not very clear what will be the impact on society once we reach 3 or 4 degrees Celsius. Therefore, there is really both a certainty on the fact that we have to take that into account and an uncertainty on what it's going to look like, which leads to the other slide. This is the first attempt by the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK to estimate this climate-related fiscal risk. And what you can see here is that in the different type of scenario, they forecast that climate change could have the impact in 2050 on the public budget of between plus 20% of debt to GDP or up to plus 45% debt to GDP. So obviously, climate change is not something which is not related to our debate about the future of the EU fiscal framework. It's really closely connected. So some food for thought on this point. There is some radical certainty. Can we really assess climate-related risk? So the problem of tipping point. Therefore, what about the precautionary principle? It's embedded in the European Treaty. We're supposed to follow this. And therefore, what about precautionary investment to reduce this climate-related fiscal risk? And so I really want you to remind that climate change will have impact on public budget, has to be taken into account, and therefore we have to do precautionary investment because we can't really know what's going to be the size of the impact, but we only know that we will have to do something. It led me to the third case in which seeking public budget surplus is really counterproductive. Is when debt is particularly cheap, which is really the case nowadays. It's when interest rates fall below the growth rate. It's happened the mechanism that we call a positive snowball effect. Basically, I won't enter into detail, but it's a sort of automatic reduction of the stock of debt. In this type of situation, debt finance expenditure investment are really a good choice because it will cost you less and the future public revenue are likely to outweigh debt servicing cost because your debt is so costless for the moment. This situation, what you call R smaller than G, is a situation in most EU countries since 2014 because interest rates are historically low. As you can see on this graph, which is about the evolution of long-term sovereign interest rate. By long-term, we mean 10-year sovereign bonds from different countries. You can see it's about France, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, Germany, Greece, Portugal, and so on and so forth. And what you can see is that back in the day, in 1993, it was between 7 and 30% interest rate on long-term debt. Nowadays, in 2020, it's between 0 and 3%. There are many explanations on why it's like that, and really happy to discuss that in Q&A or at a later stage. You can contact me, obviously, and we can discuss that, but we don't really have the time now. But what it means, the fact that nowadays the current interest rates are so low and have been reduced over the past 3 decades, is that it has an impact on the overall cost of debt for the state, which is a debt servicing cost. Here you can see on this graph is the cost of interest payment, all the interest that the state has to pay on its whole stock of debt in 1995 and nowadays for all for some important Euro area country. So in 1995, the servicing his stock of debt and rollovering his stock of debt cost to a state between 3.5 and 13% of its GDP. It was quite high for a country like Italy for many reasons. In 2021, for the same countries, between 0 and 3%, which leads us to really to one idea you have to keep in mind and keep with you is the fact that even if we have highest stock of debt, which is true, we have really no problem of debt sustainability, and that servicing this public debt for a state has rarely cost so little than nowadays. So we really have no problem with debt today. It's not a rare phenomena. This differential between interest and growth, the fact that interest rate was so lower than growth, it has been it's even more the norm than the exception, as shown by this paper of the IMF. And it's also going to be the case in the EU until at least 2031. It's an estimation from the European Commission. So what you really have to keep in mind is that we don't really have to stress about sustainability now, and normally we are not supposed to stress about it until a very long time. And so we can really do what's necessary to fight climate change and to do other necessary public investment. We don't have the time, I think, to go into detail for this one, but thanks for this.
Thank you, Ludovic. It was really clear and fascinating. I'm wondering though whether people in the room have questions for clarification. Again, we always say there are no silly questions. I mean, that's why we are here for. It's to be able to ask any question. If some words were not clear, some concepts, if a slide has gone too fast, that's your moment. There will be other moments. So I see no questions. It means it was super clear, or you are shy and we'll ask it later. So we could probably move to myth 2, which is Thomas.
Thank you, Isabelle. And it makes me realize that I did not introduce myself. How rude of me. I'm sorry. I'm Thomas. I'm a policy officer at the European Youth Forum. And because we fight for youth rights, we chose to debunk the myth that public debt is an unfair burden on future generations. Now, I'm sure you've already heard this, so let's take a deeper look at it and see what's wrong, what's right about it. Now, so we say public debt is an unfair burden on future generations. So public debt, remember myth 1, right? It's not a household's debt. It's not something that we inherit. It's just investment in a way. I'll go back to this a bit later. It's an unfair burden. Does it have to be a burden? Does it have to be unfair? Is this a technical question or is this a political question? We'll see about that. And now on the future generations, who are we talking about? Are there future generations on this planet A that can be consulted? And what is the youth demanding? We'll see about that too. Next slide, please. Let's start with the public debt thing. So as Ludovic showed, investing now, spending government money now, will result in a cost of debt that will be lower on future generations than the cost of not investing now. Mitigation of climate change, natural disasters, etc., the fiscal risk that Ludovic was talking about, is going to cost us more than investing now in a clean, fair transition. Then the ultra low interest rate, flat yield curve, R below G thing that Ludovic explained as well, means that investing now ensures long-term cheap funding. So that's about the public debt. And now the last thing is investing now on quality expenditures. So is absolutely necessary, that investment, to bridge what is called the funding gap. And if we can go to next slide, oops, did we miss something? Oh no, I'll explain the funding gap a bit later. I just wanted to come back on what Ludovic said about the McKinsey study. If this investment, so we're talking about the public part of public debt, if the investment is not funded by the states, it will be funded by no one. Because investment in a fair green transition, the sad truth is, it's just not profitable enough. What they showed is that 60% of that necessary investment before 2030 to transition to our net zero Europe, which is not zero carbon Europe, but only net zero, 60% of that investment is just not profitable enough for the private sector to seize it. So that's about the public debt. And I wanted to talk to you about that funding gap I was talking about, and that's the money we're talking about. This is an estimation by the European Commission. It's less than 1 year old, and it says that so to transition to net zero by 2030, we should be investing in the EU 400 billion euros a year more than what we're investing right now. That's 400 billion euros we need to find every year, or we need to create. That's another issue. For investment on renewable energy, on construction, on transport, on environmental protection, etc., etc. Okay, so that's the public debt thing. Yes, if we can go to the next slide, it's perfect. Thanks. Now the unfair burden part of our public debt is an unfair burden on future generations myth. This is the moment when I try not to get too emotional, because an unfair burden, really? Like, what on earth are you talking about? When you're talking about an unfair burden, if we go to the next slide, I suppose you're talking about wildfires. That's an unfair burden on future generations. There have been absolutely catastrophic wildfires all over Europe and all around the Mediterranean all summer. And that's only the beginning. We're not at plus 1.5, we're not at plus 2 degrees, we're not at plus 3 degrees. That feels like an unfair burden to me. And if we go to the next slide, I suppose you're also talking about the floodings. In Belgium, in Germany this year, hundreds of people have died. And I'm only talking about death. There's people having to forced migration. There's destruction of property. It's absolutely terrifying. That sounds like an unfair burden to me. And if we go to the next slide, and I'll go again, biodiversity laws. 80% of Europe's habitat, poor or bad condition. 1/3 of the world's species in risk of extinction. The bees are dying, the bumblebees are dying, the mosquitoes are dying. Well, that's good. But, you know, when we all know that's a problem, we have known it for dozens of years, and that's an unfair burden that's going to be passed on to future generations. So yeah, I'm trying not to get too emotional, but this thing tends to get me angry. And if we move to the next slide, I'm not the only one who sees this. Frans Timmermans, who is the VP in charge of the European Commission in charge of the Green Deal, he says, "I want to be clear. If we don't clear this development fast enough, our children and grandchildren will fight wars over water and food." So this is something we know. I mean, wars over water and food, that's an unfair burden. So, I mean, we have some problems that are more important, I think, than this public debt thing. And if we go to the next slide, I'll go for the theory rather than the memes and the images. So, states do not repay their debt. They roll it over. Remember, this is not a household's budget. And I really want to be clear on this point. This debt will be created only if we decide not to pay for the investments now. We can reform taxation, we can find the money where it is, we could create systems to finance this investment. We are refusing to do it. We are choosing to create debt, pass it on to the future generations, call it a burden, and it's a political choice. We are deliberately doing this. So really, we decide to have future generations pay for it rather than the current ones. And it's a political choice, and it should be treated as such. So I'm done with the unfair burden part. I hope I didn't get too angry. If we can go to the next slide, the future generations. So who are they? Who are the future generations? I believe some of them are already here. And have you considered consulting them? Have you considered asking the youth of Europe what they want, what they need, what they're asking for? Do you really believe that it is unfair to the young, the future generations, to invest in education, to invest in economic infrastructures, resilience-oriented infrastructures, in a sustainable industrial policy, in innovation policies? Would that really be unfair, this investment? Well, it's a question. And what do the young people of Europe and of the world want? I mean, have you heard of Fridays for Futures, global climate strikes? I mean, if we go to the next slide, when you ask the young people of Europe what they're worried about, they immensely answer climate change and environmental degradation, immensely. So this is a problem we know we're facing. The youth has been asking for investment, for action, climate action. So we need to get it going. And if we go to the next slide, I think it really sums it up quite well. And thank you, Finance Watch, for making these cartoons. They're great. Like, public debt is not an unfair burden on future generations. The problem is lack of future-oriented investments. And if I just sum up the key messages here, one, not investing now does not make economic sense. It's cheap, and it will cost us more to invest now, because we're going to have to pay for it later. Not only is debt sustainability not a problem, but we have bigger problems. We have a bigger unfair burden on our shoulders. Third, the future generations are already alive. They're already here. They should be consulted. They should be a part of this economic governance review. And it's absolutely essential that they be so. And ultimately, it's really a political choice. It's not a technicality. It's not just a few numbers that you have to customize and configure properly. It's a political choice to say this will be a burden or not. This will be an unfair one or not. And last point is on the quality of investment. When we talk about investing in climate action, in the future of youth, etc., this money needs to be invested in a smart, qualitative way, not in tax cuts, not in useless stuff. We want it for the good stuff. We need it for the good stuff, for education, for infrastructure, for climate change mitigation. So yeah, I hope I've made my case, and I'll leave the floor to Julia.
Maybe just before we go with Julia, I was wondering whether people in the room have questions for clarifications. I see that CARE published a report, maybe in the breakout group on this myth. You can also share more about this report, Anna, with us. We have time to take up a couple of questions, or if there are some. Seems not, so probably our speakers are really good, and they are. So let's move to Julia for myth number 3.
Thank you, hello everyone from me. So my name is Julia, and I also represent Finance Watch, where I work as research and advocacy officer with Ludovic and the broader team. And in the next 7 minutes, I'm going to talk about the next very popular and very politicized misconception about public debt, and namely the fact that the debt has to remain below 60% debt to GDP ratio in order to be sustainable, and in order for a government and the country to be able to pay that debt. So moving on to the next one, we can ask the question, so is it really true? If the debt is above 60%, which is a law in the European Union, is it really true that the country is not able to pay the debt? And I think a simple look at the graph, which shows what are the actual debt to GDP ratios of different countries of this world, makes us strongly question this assumption. As we see, countries like Japan, which have the debt to GDP ratio over 250%, are faring very well today and are paying back their debts, whereas we have other historical precedents, for example, Ukraine, who technically defaulted on the debt, which was 40% to GDP. So this, even without going further, we can see that that simply doesn't hold in reality, right? And to understand why the European Union ended up with having the 60% debt to GDP ratio, it's worth taking a brief historical look at this number and ask, why do we have 60 today? So the 60% debt to GDP threshold, which is, as Thomas earlier mentioned, and officially recognized in the law in the European Union, and countries who have a larger debt levels are subjected to corrective procedures. This number results from the 1992, when the European Union, back then there were 12 countries, were about to establish the European Monetary Union, meaning giving up their currency, and the interest rates were relatively low at that point in time. So that overall there was a political concerns that governments will be very irresponsible and will start taking a lot of debt and spending a lot without thinking about the consequences. So there was also a decision taken to establish an independent central bank, which would not be the lender of last resort. And in these circumstances, there was a need to have some kind of formal fiscal discipline and formal fiscal limits. And this is why this was a political decision to establish this threshold. And the exact 60% were simply the average of the government debts of the 12 member states at that point of time. So they've just taken an average and decided this will be the number. And in the meanwhile, this is part of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, Article 126 and Protocol 12. So as mentioned, this is a law. And this historical precedent also tells us that there is very little economic sense to this number, whereas for the European Union, it's an extremely important number for every country. And the other interesting point is, if you just take a think about it, this is a number which compares the debt, which is an accumulated amount over many, many years, to a GDP, which is just a yearly indicator, and it changes from year to year. So it compares stock to flow, which makes also little economic sense. And in fact, speaking about the actual science, let's say, behind the number, there are many more factors which determine if a country is able to service its debt and pay it back. So we go to the next slide. And as we already know from what Ludovic has just told us, is that, first of all, a government is not a household. There is no necessity to balance the budget every single period. And also, as we know from the previous speakers, there is a necessity to spend, in fact, in the current circumstances where our economies are now, where the environment is, where our society is. So the question would be, how do we do all of that and ensure that the debts are still paid back? So what do we need to take into account while we spend to make sure that the debt is sustainable? And as it turns out, it's a mixture of like a lot of science, of course, like the macroeconomics, and also a lot of political factors. So let us look at the 6 factors which are here on the slide. This does not have to be necessarily 6, but these are very important inputs into the analysis of the debt sustainability. So first, number 1 here are future government revenues, meaning the fact if a government is able to pay its debt depends on whether the government is able to generate income in the future, tax revenues, whether the government is able to collect those revenues as opposed to having a huge shadow economy. Second factor are fiscal risks, and Ludovic spoke about them already, meaning other future expenses that the government will need to make because it made some commitments today, like guarantees, or any huge future expenses that the government will have to make because the government is simply not investing enough in the environment, like climate risks. Number 3, cost and maturity of that. Obviously, The ability to pay back the debt depends on how expensive it is for the government to borrow, the interest rates, and also if the debt will have to be paid back in the next 1 or 2 years, meaning short maturities, or if those repayments are spread across many, many years to go, and this will be easier. Number 4, difference between interest rates and growth rates. Again, if a government is investing productively, and that is able to generate economic growth, meaning also revenues, that makes it more likely that the debt is sustainable. Number 5, investor beliefs and perceptions also influence their payment capacity very strongly, as they determine if the investors are ready to borrow money to the government, and these investor perceptions also determine the risk premia, the interest rates which investors request for borrowing money. And the last factor here, number 6, types of debt holders, meaning, for example, if the debt is owned by domestic versus foreign investors. For example, Japanese debt, which is huge as we saw, is mostly owned by domestic investors, which makes Japanese government much less likely be subject to the influence by foreign borrowers who might come up with sudden redemptions or who might change their sentiment and require suddenly higher interest rates. Another example is Greece before the debt crisis of 2010, where the debt was largely owned by foreign investors, big international institutions. So at the end, as we see, the sustainability of debt does not simply boil down to a very simple one-size-fits-all figure, but it's quite a complex analysis. It is subject to uncertainty. It deals with probabilities. So unfortunately, it does not get any simpler, but what we need to know is that the 60% is definitely meaningless, and we need to depart from it towards more case-by-case debt sustainability analysis. And the last thing I want to mention is while it is not formally, while the 60% is still a formal hard threshold in the European Union with all the rules around it, there is the debt sustainability analysis, which the European Commission is doing every year. The only thing is that debt sustainability analysis does not get enough political weight, whereas, of course, it's very simple to stick to the 60%, imposing sometimes very austere and strict conditions on the governments, which actually do place a burden on the future generations, and instead of ensuring we will have a sustainable future. So I will finish here, and of course, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Julia. Amazing how, yeah, in fact, 60% means nothing, and it's much more complex. I was wondering whether there are questions, expressions that were unclear.
Maybe one thing that I could add myself, of course, the 60% is the European Union magic threshold, right? The one around which all the governance is built. You would also often hear the 100%, right? Because 100 sounds like, oh, your debt is equal to your GDP. This is also very scary, which equally makes no economic sense. And as the previous speaker said, given the currently low interest rates, it actually makes much more sense to invest today to ensure that the debt will be borrowed cheaply and can be carried over to the future. And as long as there is no huge swings in the investor sentiments, the governments can always keep rolling over their debt, making productive investments, ensuring there is growth, there is social cohesion. And yeah, of course, again, the exercise is gets quite complex as opposed to having just 60% more or less. But this is how the economic reality of it is, unlike the political one.
Thank you, Julia. I see one hand. Anna, over to you.
Yes, thank you for those interesting presentations. It was really clear. I was wondering if it's more of a general question for, not especially for the last one, but anyone could answer. What is actually the interest of, let's say, Germany, for instance, to keep pushing for keeping a 3% or a 60% rule?
Thank you, Anna. Who wants to take that? Ludovic.
Yes, it's not really an easy question to answer, but there are many also psychological mechanism, but also I would say that some political interest to present yourself as fiscally responsible. So basically, when we started and we included in the European Treaty this number of 360%, this was a lot of countries that really did not really trust each other, and we needed to have some sort of number that looked reasonable. It was mostly higher than the stock of debt that of many of this country, and therefore it looks okay to start from this basis. And just now we are sort of stuck with it because it's hard to think that one country or some person in different country, for example, CDU-CSU in Germany, could say, yeah, we're going to agree to remove a limit for spending from the European Treaty. It's not the way they want to present themselves. So I think there is also, this sort of narrative about you are the fiscally responsible one, even though you have less and less economists to say that 60% make any sense. Back in the day, there was the youth fight in 2015 about a paper that said basically that there would be some sort of problem for growth after a stock of debt of 90%, and basically all economists went into a huge fight on that, and we realized that this number was completely false, and therefore for the economist crew, these thresholds make no sense, but they're just there. So we are kind of stuck with it also because reforming the treaty requires unanimity, and every country therefore have a veto play a role.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ludovic. I see no other question for the moment, so maybe we can. Oh, Colleen, do you want to ask your question or your comment? Maybe that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'll do that. Excuse me, I've got some other sound in the background. I do apologize. I'll stop that. Yeah, I'm interested. There seems to be a repetitive theme. Well, we need to get growth, but yet, the planetary boundaries and what a lot of people are talking about with the climate and ecological crisis is that the developed economies actually need now, they're highly developed. They actually have a lot. There are equality issues. That's a different matter of distribution that they need to basically level off. There's the author Catherine Trebeck has a book called The Economics of Arrival, like the idea of a plane that's reached its cruising altitude. So in that case, G will be 0. So if you want R less than G, R is going to be negative in real terms. So how do you do that? Do you have a different basis where you actually penalize people for holding cash or financial bonds? And you only can get a real rate of return by making investment in real service and productive activity. I wonder what the speakers think about that question of boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Ludovic, I guess you want to take it.
If I may, with pleasure. It's really a very important and hard question to answer because what we would like to do and what we are stuck with and what are the opportunities in front of us. So it's true that we have this fiscal framework. We're trying to remove it, to change it to ensure we can do enough public investment to fight climate change. But in the long run, as I said, insufficient growth is an issue, and we already have a problem with planetary boundaries. So I really understand your concern and really share the same type of concern. There's no very clear answer, I think, to your question. Just on my personal opinion on growth, it's more like it's an outcome. I'm more not in favor of degrowth, but in favor of a growth, to be agnostic about growth. So here, my impression that for the moment, in the short run, we have R is smaller than G. Interest rates are below growth rates, and we should use this opportunity to do the investment. And it will produce growth for a certain amount of time, but it could produce also an economy that won't grow after a while, after, I don't know, a decade of the necessary investment, will stop to grow and will be more resource efficient and will be able to fit into planetary boundaries. So the only issue is that we are trying to define a fiscal framework that's supposed to last for decades, while we have an issue now that need investment now. And I agree with you on the long run, but on the short run, we will probably have a lot of growth to transition to a more sustainable economy. I hope it answers part of the question. I don't know if other speakers have another opinion.
No, I mean, if I just may add, the Youth Forum doesn't have a policy on growth or degrowth, but what we're advocating here is more investment than growth, and I think that's a really important point. And as Ludovic was saying, maybe growth will be an outcome of this investment, maybe not, but there is no way we will transition to a clean, green society without investing today, now, in the current economic system that we are in. I just wanted to stress that point.
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, in an earlier slide of Ludovic, I mean, it was mentioned that some sectors need to grow and other sectors definitely need to degrow. I mean, the question is what is growing, what is not growing. I suggest, because we will have time also later on in the breakout groups, or I want us to have time in the breakout groups to go to Met 4, which means that I hand over the floor to Ludovic again.
Thank you, Isabelle. So this last meet is about the idea that our fiscal framework is fit for the climate crisis. Basically, this fight about should we reform the European fiscal framework, the European fiscal rules, the Stability Growth Pact, is already there since few years, and different countries have pushed to change this part of the fiscal framework. And for example, Germany, among which the former still finance minister Olaf Scholz said at the point that what happened with the COVID crisis is the proof that the fiscal framework and the fiscal rules are flexible enough, basically, to cope with any type of issue we'll have. You just have to invoke the general escape clause to froze the rule for time, and it will be okay. What we think is that it's not really the case, and that other change need to be taken into account to really connect this fiscal framework that has been created in 1992 and over 30 years with the new reality today of ultra low interest rates, no problem of debt sustainability, but really a big risk of the sustainability of the world. So here, there are three main points I want to discuss. It will be a bit shorter than the others, but we will try already here to dig into, to speak about some element of the fiscal framework that we are going to present in depth tomorrow morning in the third workshop on how to reform the European fiscal framework, where you're going to hear all the detail about its working and what should be changed and how to change it. But the 3 points I want to raise here to answer to this idea that the fiscal framework is fit for the climate crisis is the first one about climate-related fiscal risk that we discussed in Meet 1, that are basically for the moment not taken into account in debt sustainability analysis. So, as mentioned by my colleague Julia, the Commission is doing is both assessing the budget of the state to ensure that they follow the European fiscal rules, and there is this process. And aside, they are also doing this sort of debt sustainability analysis, where they basically acknowledge that debt sustainability is not just about a threshold, about 60% or something else. It's much more complex. And in this debt sustainability analysis, they're analyzing different type of elements, among which the one my colleague Julia told you about a bit sooner. But climate-related fiscal risks are not yet taken into account. As you've seen, the Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK have done that for the UK. So we know it's feasible. It's something we think should be pushed, even though there are some sort of radical uncertainty on how to calculate that. At least we should try to assess it, to have some sort of vision, and to have at least the political understanding that climate change will have an impact on debt sustainability, and that therefore, and this is the important point, we have to exclude from the deficit rule the precautionary investment to fight climate change, because climate change will harm debt sustainability. This is what is called in general green golden rule. You will hear this term often, and it's really something we're trying to push with all our partners from Fiscal Matters, so European Youth Forum, Climate Action Network, NEF, and many others. So this is the first point. Take into account climate-related fiscal risk, in-depth sustainability analysis, and exclude precautionary investment. Second point is the fact to recognize that fiscal rules today, as they are, negatively impact public investment. And if it negatively impact public investment, it negatively also impact climate-oriented investment. Two. Why? It's because you have different elements of the fiscal framework. One is the debt reduction benchmark, which has been added in 2011 after the great financial crisis and the wave of austerity pushed by some countries in Europe. This idea is that basically a member state that have a level of debt higher than 60% should reduce this amount, which is higher than 60%, from 1/20th per year. And basically, it said that you have to cut in everything pretty fast. And obviously, this debt reduction benchmark, if it's applied again nowadays, has a great chance to break the recovery because you will cut in spending while the economy is not on track yet. Second point, we don't have a special treatment for investment. It's not like the debt reduction benchmark only applied to silly, not useful spending, but it's to everything. And unfortunately, it's politically easier to cut investment than to cut, I don't know, the wages from teacher or at the hospital, from nurses. So in general, it's investment that are cut first, and so you have less investment, obviously. What could be done to fight this is first to focus on the quality of public spending. And as you know, the state has to sort of submit their budget each year to the European Commission, then check if it's okay with the fiscal rules. You could imagine then in this budget that they send to the Commission, they could have a section on the quality of public spending where they would have to show which part of spending is going in favor of climate transition, of biodiversity, of this and that. And we could imagine other sort of category, obviously. And again, the second part is to have this sort of green golden rule that would exclude precautionary investment to fight climate change and others type of issue. The third and last point is the fact that current fiscal rules are not flexible enough to allow for the necessary precautionary investment spending. When Olaf Scholz say it's flexible enough, it's because you have some clause that has been added through the 30 years of the evolution of the European fiscal rules and framework. And for example, you have the general escape clause that allow to freeze the rule when there is a big crisis, like we have now with the COVID crisis. But you have other type of clause, for example, the investment clause and the structural reform clause. But the issue is that even though it's the right spirit, the conditions are way too restrictive, and it has been acknowledged by the European Commission itself. So it's really well known. For example, one of the conditions is that you can do investment, or you can have a bit more deficit for investment or for structural reform, but it can be just for 1 year and maximum 0.75% of your GDP, which is absolutely nothing. So what we could do here, the solution, again, it's either to ease the flexibility of the clause that already exists, the investment structural clause, or to create this green golden rule to exclude this type of precautionary investment. Obviously, there are many other things that could be changed, but really, if you want to come tomorrow, we'll have a bit more time to discuss that, and maybe also here in the Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ludovic. Well, now that we got relatively deep explanations about these formats, we would like to propose you to move to the last part of this workshop, which would be 15 minutes in breakout groups. The suggestion is that as we are approximately 30 persons, we could have 4 breakout groups corresponding to these formats, and you can of course choose in which breakout group you want to go. And after that, you will be brought back in plenary just for very last 5 minutes, whereby from each group, we could have 1 or 2 ideas, main ideas that you would like to share with others in plenary. So I'm going to pass, before you go in the rooms, I'm going to pass in the chat a Jamboard. So for those who haven't used it yet, you just click on the link and you will see that depending on the room where you go, you can access myth 1, myth 2, myth 3, or myth 4. And you will see that there are, in fact, we are picking up your brains, to be honest, to help us think what we could do to debunk this myth in maybe a more funny or more accessible way, or what we could do to campaign on these issues, or if you want to campaign on these myths or against these myths, what you would need. So without further delay, I suggest that we go, I mean, you can pick up the room you want to go, and don't forget to agree who takes notes, or everyone takes notes in the Jamboard, and who reports back the most brilliant idea from your group. So see you later.
Hello, Celine. Thanks for joining the breakout room. I was feeling a bit lonely here.
Hello.
Let's wait a few seconds. I see that there's still 15 people who are unassigned. We'll see how that goes. The breakout room part is always the messy part.
Right. May I ask what your role is within the European Youth Forum?
Yeah, I'm a campaign officer. I work specifically on fiscal policy within the sustainability cluster.
Very interesting. I'm a member of the Maltese National Youth Council. So
oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Welcome, Jessica, and hi, Asia. Hi, Mia.
Hi there.
There's still a few people who are unassigned, so maybe let's wait until we have 12 minutes remaining. Oh, I'll send out the Jamboard thing. Oh. So you should be able to go there, and maybe I can share my screen actually, so that we all see what's happening there. Oh. Easier to say than to do. Do you all see that? Yep. Okay, great. So does someone want to volunteer to report back? It's less than a minute of speaking and just a bit of note taking. Oh, that's the hard part, right? Being the volunteer. Okay, we'll see if Jan joins us. Maybe he'll be okay to do that. We shall see. So, our myth is public debt is a burden on future generation. I hope you all know a bit more why it's not now. And the idea is to find ideas of how we could spread that message across and and share our thoughts. Usually we just go for slogans, but slogans it can be a bit short. Do you want to start with slogans? Yeah. I don't know if you've ever used Jamboard, but if you're there, you can take a post-it, move it, write on it, and do something like this. And we can also talk. That's also an option. If you have other questions on myth number 2, feel free to ask. And we can try to answer them together. I'm just gonna go see a second if the other breakout rooms are working.
Thomas, I just joined from the other one because most of the people, they just did not join any group. So we merged 1 and 4 and 2 and 3. So I'll be
okay.
Here. Yeah.
Great. So we're 2 and 3. So public debt is sustainable below 60% debt to GDP ratio, and public debt is a burden on future generations. I wish I could modify this Jamboard, but I can't. Is everybody on page number 2 and see me moving this wonderful post-it around? Yeah. I guess I'll try something. I'm not very creative in slogans. I do slides better.
So what did you agree that we could do ourselves, or we just like try to discuss?
Well, we're trying to do both, but right now I'm the only one writing in the post-its.
I think with regards to this posted just now, the invest now, it's a good slogan, but I think the narrative for it is a bit more challenging because at the moment, I think green bonds for someone who's investing, for example, are not the most attractive. So I think perhaps something we can think about is trying to adapt the narrative of such instruments to make sure that they are more attractive to people who have the disposable money to invest.
And what would you think is like missing? Like why don't they appear attractive?
I think because looking at it from a financial perspective solely, it is not currently the most profitable. There are other options which are more profitable. And I think that's what we need to focus on. It's not just a matter of a financial return option, it's also a matter of helping the environment and putting funding into something that can help environmental projects and things like that. So perhaps that's the narrative that we need to focus on a bit more in financial spheres.
Well, I think actually that's exactly it, right, Tomas, is that a lot of these investments, they might not necessarily appear very attractive or super profitable for private investors in the moment. And this is why it's very important that the governments have the space, like the fiscal space, to make those investments, because we all recognize their importance. And while I, of course, want to get some profit, maybe as a private investor, and I'm not ready to kind of wait, the government can do that. And they have to do that.
Right.
I wrote it down in 2 post-its. I hope I was loyal to what you said. Any other ideas for narratives or maybe exciting stuff like stunts and flash mobs? Did you see the plastic? There's a plastic dragon in Brussels today made of plastic waste. It's like a 3-meter high dragon they put it in front of the European Commission. I think it's Zero Waste Europe that's doing that, or Break Free from Plastic. That could be exciting stuff. Well, like the plastic dragon isn't adapted to what we do, but I thought it was a funny idea.
I saw a nice cartoon for them for this day, I think, on LinkedIn.
Oh yeah.
About the fish who is swimming in the sea full of bottles, instead of, like, you know, like centuries ago when the fish would just see one bottle swimming on the surface. Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the slogans I sometimes use is like, there are no bankers on a dead planet. But I'm not even sure it's true. Sometimes I also say that once everything will have collapsed, the last thing you'll find is a bank waiting in the middle of the collapsed stuff. But I'll write that slogan down.
You know, this very well fits our prudential banking regulation and climate campaign. What about something like Invest for Future instead of Fridays for Future?
But even speaking of prudential banking regulation, and that's fair, it's also important to encourage banks and banking structures to fight for this and to discuss and create campaigns in favor of it.
I can invite you to join our banking and insurance prudential regulation and climate campaign that will be coming.
Yes, and I think there's two things to do at the same time, right? Encourage banks and financial structures to invest in climate action, and also to disinvest, to get out of other, as Isabelle was saying, some sectors need to grow and some others need to degrow.
Yeah, I also want to, in a positive way, I mean, you need money to also invest in a positive future, like, I don't know, well-being economy or whatever you want to call it. But I don't know if it's a slogan or narrative. And then I don't really have a good idea, but what I like sometimes is when you have something that relates to the topic and then you hand it out to MEPs or something, or like people who just are in front of the parliament. But then with topics that I don't know what would be a good thing you could kind of hand out so that people, that maybe slogans also on the thing, so if people take it, they have to be reminded that that topic that is a burden.
So I didn't hear all what you said properly. Did you?
Kathy, I think you have some echo, like in your room or microphone.
Okay, yeah, maybe I will try to switch. I can write down for now.
Cool, thanks. Do you have the Jamboard link? I'll put it back in the chat. Where's that? Oh, that's my screen sharing. I don't know. Can you do it, Julia, please?
Yeah, let me see. Sure.
I have it.
Okay, thanks.
I have it. Okay, great.
Okay. We still need a plastic dragon idea.
What about, I have not a flash mob idea, like burning, you know, like burning savings books. Oh, yeah. It's like, let's say if you save a lot today just because you want to save and have like nice savings, and then actually at the end, if we don't invest, right, like we don't have a proper future, then it means we're just like burning them. But it actually reminds me of a precedent, because I'm originally from a former Soviet Union country where a lot of people, they've been like saving, there was kind of a culture in the Soviet Union of saving a lot, and then when the Soviet Union collapsed and like there was no clarity of where the central bank and like the national bank's money is going, all those savings were just lost. And I know that like my family, my father's family, they had a lot of savings. They were like really saving a lot, like not affording anything in their life. Like it's actually kind of analogy. It's like if you just try to have black books, right? Like no debts today. At the end, the Soviet Union collapsed and people were left with nothing. So.
Yeah, that's a good stunt idea. If you have a last idea, 16 seconds remaining.
I can try if you want. Not a flash mob thing, so I don't know if it's going to be really relevant, but more a kind of online game Monopoly style, where you would actually see the impact of of investment, public debt, and so on I don't know how to say it, but basically, you would see basically that you have to invest now. If not, you're gonna have an impact in the future. So this kind
that sounds great. Actually, it's like SimCity, another version.
Ah, yeah, with money involved, but yeah.
Maybe, okay, we don't really have time. I was thinking like if we should mention the fact, like if everybody thinks there is anything else about this concept of public debt as a fair burden, which needs to be clarified additionally or explained, or, like that brings it closer to the people.
Well, I think we have 9 seconds left, so I'll be reporting back to plenary.
So we are back. Let me ask to, we have 4 minutes left. So basically it's 1 minute for each group, or 1 minute and a half, but we had 2 groups, so it's going to be easy. So who wants to speak for the other group? Julia's group. Just
I think
1 or 2
me.
of the best ideas you had.
I think that's me. We were finishing on a great idea of creating a sort of online monopoly kind of game where you have to manage public finances, and if you don't invest now, then you're screwed basically. So that was a great idea, and quickly we talked about changing the narrative around green bonds, environmental projects, in order to encourage financial structures and banks to invest in climate action and to disinvest fossil fuels and brown investments. And another idea that was flying around was a kind of stunt where, so either we would hand out stuff to people with a slogan on the thing, and then they're reminded of the slogan, or where we would burn saving books to show that there is no point in saving money right now and we really need to invest it. I hope that's what was talked about and I didn't forget anything.
Thank you. It looks brilliant. Anyway, we will have the Jamboard and we can share it with participants afterwards for them to have a second look. Till, may I ask you to report back from the other group?
Sure, with pleasure. I feel like in our group, we mainly posed more questions than finding answers, but we talked about things like how we can channel actually more money into the green transition, and that could be done with something like a green tag on financial products. I think the European Union is working on this under the label of a taxonomy. And if there's like not a harmonized kind of standard for green or sustainable bonds or investments, how could we do this in another way? We talked about what should we do in terms of if the fiscal rules are relaxed, how do we ensure that the spending that is done is actually quality spending, that it goes to sustainable investments, that it is properly monitored and evaluated and not misused. We had an example of Hungary here, where the government is misusing it basically for their election campaign, and that this shouldn't happen. And we talked about the general idea of like, how can we let go of the growth paradigm? How can we stay within the planetary boundaries and not kind of chase growth endlessly? And we had a short question raised about if we should think about things like debt-free money, which I guess goes into a much bigger kind of discussion, or do we have to remove debt at some point? And a last point was raised that was about that in the European Union, the states are actually not sovereign anymore in the monetary sense, and maybe that this is something, a bit of a tension here that needs to be solved in the long run in Europe to be more operational. And yeah, I think those were the main points.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, I mean, it's really time to end. I would like to thank you all for staying till the end. If maybe you are interested to remain informed on fiscal issues and the upcoming reform, there is a mailing list which you can join by filling this Google Doc. And then maybe, I mean, it was said before, but this was the second workshop of a series of 3, and the third one is tomorrow morning at 10:30. And yes, we have a reading list thanks to Colleen. Take note of bank job. And tomorrow's workshop will be on options for reform, which we are going to learn from. So thanks again to everyone, and have a good late afternoon if you are on European time. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone. Thank you very much, Isabelle, for
Thank you.
moderating.
Yeah, thank you.